So I took this photo last spring, and it's of a floor in a mill factory in New Bedford where some metal piece that was coming off of something was like embedded into the floor over and over again. So I really liked the texture on the floor, so I took a picture of it. And I'm going to make this picture into a seamless repeating pattern using Photoshop. So we haven't made any of our repeats in Photoshop yet. So we should do this because for the next project, you will have the option of making your repeats in Photoshop. And we are going to make photorealistic repeats with Photoshop, which is different than all the repeats we've been doing, right? Because we've only been doing these really graphic repeats, okay? So this is new content. So I have this, photo doesn't really look that great right now. I'm gonna use an adjustment layer and kind of balance out this layer. There's lots of white in it, and levels is a really good way to balance the like blacks and whites in a photo. So with a levels layer, which is this adjustments layer, I can click and drag on the black in the image and raise it, or I can click and drag on the white and raise it, okay? And you can also adjust like the center balance and where that lives. So the way I use levels is I normally bring the black one up to where the like arch of this starts. Normally if it's an unbalanced picture and you have to use levels, there is kind of this bell shape in the middle. If it's a well-balanced picture, it's going to have like it'll just be like kind of straight across, it'll be even. And I lower the white down until I think it looks good, okay? So you can see the difference that made, right? We've got a lot more depth in my picture, okay? So that's with no levels, and this is with the levels turned on. So just clicking and dragging on these has made a big difference. Okay, I am going to merge these layers into the same layer because I don't really want to mess later on with like having an extra adjustments layer. So we can choose the little 3 or 4 line thing there and choose merge layers. And then I also want to unlock the background layer just by double clicking on it. The background layer always comes up locked. You just double click on it. Before I start making the pattern, I am also going to use the dodge tool and brighten up the pattern. The dodge tool, if I like use it right here, you can see that it is making the pattern brighter, but I can make it a lot bigger. I like to make it like really big when I'm kind of doing this stuff. And these areas over here that are dark, I can like I want to bring them up so that it all feels like the same level. If I don't make this all feel kind of like the same level of brightness, then they're going to be like dark patches in my repeating pattern, which might be what you want, but it might not be. Okay. I think I also want my lines to be straight because it's going to be easier to make my repeating pattern nicely if my lines are straight. So I'm going to transform this. So edit transform, but I guess you have to have the layer selected. Edit transform rotate, and I'm just going to rotate this. Should I turn on my rulers? Because then you can drag out a guide. Come on. There we go. And we're going to try to make sure those are both straightish, and that'll just make making the pattern easier. And we're going to crop it back down so we don't have any of this background in it. Crop tool, crop tool. Okay, even a little further. You have to hit enter to apply the crop tool. So before I get to actually making the repeating pattern, I have a little demonstration here about why we're going to use this pattern the way we're going to cut it up, essentially. So I have some artwork here that I drew, my beautiful flowers. And we want to make this a seamless pattern, but what we can't tell right now is how it looks around the edges, right? But if we cut this up, and we're going to take like the left and the right side and swap them. I wish I had tape. And then we're also going to take the top and the bottom and swap those. Let me see if I can do this. We will be left with the seams in the middle of our artwork now. God, I should have got tape in preparation for this demonstration. But now we have the seams, right? Okay, so now I could, put this down and I could draw in here with all of my, with my pen. I don't know where my pen went. Otherwise I would. And then when we put it back into the right shape, it would still have all of those seamless moments around the edge, right? So I really wanted to draw onto it. Doesn't matter. We are going to adjust this picture so that we can see the seams, okay? Because right now, if we defined this as a pattern, we would have a lot of seams. It would be really obvious. In fact, I can show you guys. We can go to Edit, Define Pattern in Photoshop. That's where it lives. And in Photoshop, it's trickier to make half drops and straight repeats, and mostly it's trickier to make half drops and bricks, and mostly we make straight repeats. I can go over how to make them later, but so this is our pattern as it looks like right now. I'm going to go over how I got here in a little bit, but you can see that especially on the top and bottom seams, there's a real obvious seam on the top and bottom, but actually left to right, it's like surprisingly difficult to spot. But this is the corner right there. That's like the seam. So we're going to make all of that kind of disappear. So to do that, we need to use a filter called Offsets. So we're going to choose Filter Other Offsets. And what this does is it moves the picture to the left and right. So if I don't have it set to wrap around, which it's supposed to be set to wrap around for this project, but if I don't have it set to wrap around, when I move this, you're just going to see the picture go off the right. Okay, and when I move this one, the picture goes off the bottom. When I have wrap around set, it brings the bottom of the picture up to the top of the picture, and it just keeps wrapping it around the picture. Okay, so now we can see the center seam of our image. So sometimes I will find out the width and height of this image ahead of time and exactly put in half and half of the width and the height in here. But lately I've just been like fudging these numbers until they look pretty centered, and that works. Like it doesn't have to be exact here because we just want to get a feel for the center of the pattern. Sorry, okay, there we go. So the one thing we don't want to do right now is do any kind of manipulation of the edges, okay? Because right now the edges are seamless to one another. The dots that go off this edge come on this edge. So we don't want to touch them at all. We don't want to touch our edges, okay? Don't touch your edges. I hope you guys are listening. This is handy to be able to make the textures like this in Photoshop. I use this kind of thing all the time. So we need to look at this kind of seam right here. Can you guys see the seam a little bit on here? And we could use the clone tool to do that. I don't think I've talked about the clone tool very much. And if I just take a second to explain what it does, the clone tool takes pixels from one section and brings it to another section of the illustration. So right now, the first time I click the clone tool, nothing would happen and it would actually give me an error message if I tried to draw with it. You have to option click to define a source point. So I'm going to choose Alt or Option and I get a little crosshairs instead, right? See the crosshairs? And we can click where we want to start copying pixels from. And then we can move over to any part of the document where we want to start copying the pixels, and there we have the pixels. So we could use the clone tool, that is definitely an option, and we could pick out sections that we think would work on the line and like copy and paste them and make it less obvious, and that would work totally fine. But there is something called content aware fill that I like to, Photoshop has actually made it a lot better recently in its last couple updates, but I've always used it to make these types of patterns. So before I show you how to use content aware fill here, I want to show you what it was actually designed for. So if you have an image like this where you have like a client or someone who's like on a backdrop, but maybe you've caught part of the background in the backdrop, or maybe like you're taking a picture of a client and they're in front of a really nice sky, but then there's like an awkward, bird or sign or something in the middle of the sky that you want to remove. Content aware fill does a really good job. So if I select everything but the pink, and we go to edit, I just go to edit fill. I think it's simpler than actually going to this one called content aware fill. We can talk about that, but I don't know if it's really necessary. So we can go to fill, and in fill they have a few options. You can fill with a pattern, you can fill with black, whites, the color, but you can also choose a content aware fill, and then we can hit OK, and it has to think about it for a bit, but it automatically fills the background with that pink. And it tries to do as best as it can. I got it. Come on. Okay. It tries to do the best it can in terms of like grabbing or trying to keep the gradient from dark to light correct. It hasn't done the best job on the left here, but on the right it's done an okay job of trying to keep the gradient. If we chose edit content aware fill, it actually allows us to tell it where we want to sample. So if for some reason the content aware fill was like sometimes it'll like put little people, it'll like break up the people, it'll think they're part of the background or something, and it'll like put them in here. It's not doing it right now, but we can tell it that we don't want it to sample the person at all, and now it should just do the content aware fill with the background. It was anyway, but that is kind of how that works. It's a little bit unnecessary at this level. So let's.
When you selected the things around her, like the background,
yeah.
I know you used that one selection tool, but did you press a button to like be able to take it off? You like didn't hold your mouse down the time?
I held, yeah, okay, yeah, I held, let's hit cancel. I used this tool, which is probably the more annoying tool to use because you do have to hold your mouse down the whole time. And I am holding my mouse down the whole time there, but then I'm just holding shift and then I'm going again and I'm holding my mouse down the whole time. It might have been easier to use one of the other tools. And then you like wouldn't have, I don't know. It's a balance trying to figure out the selection tools. Yeah, so all I did without going to that fancy content aware fill was just go to fill, and then without having to deal with that second menu at all, it just does what it wants, and it kind of does its best guess as to what the pattern should look like. Okay. How do we apply that back here? What we can do is, as long as we aren't touching the pixels on the edge, is we can select this kind of cross seam that's in the center, and we can use content aware fill for that to make it seamless. Okay, so I think I am going to use the polygonal lasso tool. And I am going to get almost, but not quite, all the way to the edge of the artboard. And I'm going to choose just like a big cross. Almost, but not quite, to the edge of the artboard. Okay, so we have the cross shape, and now we can go to edit content aware fill, and we will just see what it does. If it doesn't work, you know, you can always choose edit undo. Oh, I went into this version of it. Oh, that's weird. So this is actually probably a good reason to go into this world instead of just going to edit fill. This is probably a good reason to use the content aware fill menu, because now we have the option of telling this that I don't know if this is going to work out, but of telling it that we don't want it to use the floorboard cracks. And we'll see how it does. It's thinking about it. And now it put no floorboard cracks in the center, but of course it backfired because I now have no floorboard cracks through there. But I think it's worth it because it looks really good otherwise, and we can put those floorboard cracks back in a second. So I'm going to hit OK. And one main difference between going to edit fill and going to edit content aware fill is that the content aware fill menu gives you a layer. So now I have this layer here that I could actually move around if I wanted to, right? And in order to make them the same layer again, we would have to choose them both, click on that little options menu in the layers panel, and choose merge layers. And then if we want to get these guys back to having a line, we can just select them and go to edit fill. So just going to edit fill is not going to give you that extra layer on top. It's just going to do its best to continue it. So it did the left one, not the right one. So you can do it as many times as you need, and honestly, it's probably going to do something different each time you go to edit fill. Each time you select that area, you can keep selecting smaller and smaller areas that you don't like and choosing Edit Fill, and it will keep adjusting them. There we go. So now we should have a seamless pattern. So if we wanted to, we could go to Filter, Other Offset again, and try to kind of look at it. This is kind of more closer to the original picture, back centered on my original picture. That isn't totally necessary because at that point in the pattern making process, it's going to be seamless no matter where it is on Filter, Other Offsets. It's just going to be seamless. So we can choose Define Pattern. We can hit OK. And now this pattern is defined in Photoshop's like pattern folder or wherever. I'm not sure where that stuff lives, but it is accessible. So on a new artboard that's nice and big, we can now make a fill layer. And the easiest way to do it is to go to Layer, New Fill Layer, Pattern. There's actually lots of ways to make a pattern fill layer, but this is my favorite way. So Layer, New Fill Layer, Pattern. And this is my favorite way because when you hit OK here, it then gives you some options. So I can tell it I actually want it to be a smaller scale, and I can view it at a smaller scale. A much smaller scale. This is apparently a very large pattern. So there we have my kind of distressed floorboard pattern. It's definitely stripy. I would probably spend a little bit more time maybe using the burn tool to just kind of like darken up some of those sections and then defining it again. But whenever you're using any of these tools, at this point where it's already seamless, like I've already spent some time making sure it's seamless, I never want to touch any of these tools to the edge. If I'm using the burn tool, I can only use it in the center of the artwork. As soon as I touch an edge, it's no longer going to be seamless, right? Now it's dark up here and light down there, and that's not what we want. So if we wanted to adjust any of those, we would then have to go to Filter, Other Offset, and get it so that kind of this seam is in the middle, right? We can adjust, you know, where it lives, and then we could darken it up. We could lower the exposure so it darkens it up only a tiny, tiny bit. Okay, so that's the burn and dodge tools. The burn tool makes things darker. The dodge tool makes things lighter. I only recently realized that dodge and burn are terms that are used in photography in terms of like in the dark room, you will dodge an image to make it lighter in the dark room, and you will burn an image to make it darker in the dark room. I'm not a photographer. I didn't know, but that's where those terms come from. So we can make this a little bit darker, go to Edit, Define Pattern, and then over here, I can always edit what pattern is showing on my pattern fill layer that I made that layer by going to Layer, New Fill Layer, Pattern. But I can double click on it down here and I can choose my new pattern, which is a little bit more even. Okay. And I think that is everything I wanted to talk about right now in Photoshop. There's one thing I have been neglecting to teach you, which is how to make texture repeats. I made it not a requirement on one of the projects that you add texture to your pattern. I removed that requirement, but we could make a textured garment or a textured pattern really quick. So if we go to, I'm just going to open up that guy. one of these. So in some cases, you might want to put a texture on top of your pattern to make it look kind of closer to its intended end product. So we could grab like a close-up picture of a yarn or a knit texture. This guy, oh, that's like actually a vector image. I want more like a picture someone took. So we will copy this one and we will open this up on its new page in Photoshop. And we will define this as a pattern. I'm not going to make sure it's seamless right now because I think it's going to be fine. So you can just go to Edit, Define Pattern, and hit OK. So now on top of this layer, I'm going to make a new fill layer with my yarn in it. I'm going to make it bigger even though it'll get blurry because of this. I'm just kind of cheating right now. I think that'll be fine, especially because we're going to make it transparent. So in Photoshop and in Illustrator, it's actually accessible in both of them. There's something called opacity, right? So you guys are familiar with opacity. What is opacity? It's an easy one.
How see-through something?
Exactly. And then there's something called opacity settings. So I have opacity right here in my layers panel, and I can make things more transparent. And you can see it kind of looks like the texture is applied to it. But I can also go to the left of opacity here. It's still on kind of like the same row. And I can choose from all of these opacity settings. So as I scroll through them, they're going to show up on here. And these are just like different ways that that the layer can be transparent. So Photoshop is then applying transparency like only to dark colors or only on top, or it's mainly like just giving its texture, or it's mainly giving its color. And all of these are good for different levels of background. Like overlay is normally really good if the background is kind of a more neutral color, but you can see that overlay isn't working at all on the yellow sections of this. The texture isn't showing up at all. And if I want the texture to be like across all of this, I'm gonna have to keep moving. So I normally honestly look at all of these and then I decide which one I want. So I think one of these upper ones was really good. Linear burn or multiply. Multiply is pretty standard. I normally end up choosing multiply or I end up choosing overlay in terms of like getting these textures right. So multiply looks good. And if we want like more of that yellow to come through, we can still lower the opacity, okay? But it's just kind of getting that texture onto the color in a different way. So that's kind of two ways to use Edit, Define Pattern in Photoshop. You can use it to actually make a pattern, definitely. And you can also use it to make textures that then get applied to your patterns for like special effects. Questions? Questions on anything? Okay, let's take a break then until, I guess 10:40. And then I'm going to go around and just kind of meet with you guys individually about your mood boards and your projects, and you guys can start on your homeworks. Next class, we're going to do an in-class activity. Thanks.